The gray sky mirrored the somber mood in Charlotte's heart as she stood among the few guests gathered for her father Samuel Harrington's funeral. The soft sound of rain hitting the umbrellas was muffled by murmured conversations in the background, but she paid no attention to the condolences around her. Her eyes were fixed on the coffin being slowly lowered into the grave. Samuel, the founder of Harrington Industries, had been a dominant figure in Charlotte's life. His presence was always marked by emotional distance and strict control over everything, from business to family. Although Charlotte was his daughter, she was never treated as his successor. That role had always been reserved for Richard, her older brother and the natural heir to the company. Charlotte had never received her father's acknowledgement. She had always worked hard, seeking some form of approval that he would never give. Now, with Samuel's death, the void she felt was even deeper, not only because of the loss but also because she knew she would never have the chance to change his perception of her. As usual, Richard stood beside the grave, his expression a mixture of mourning and triumph. He had always been their father's favorite, the rightful heir. Charlotte knew Richard had been waiting for this moment for a long time, the moment when he would take full control of Harrington Industries. After the ceremony, Charlotte retreated to a quieter corner of the cemetery, trying to process all her feelings. The cold wind wrapped around her, and she hugged herself as if trying to ward off the discomfort. It was then that she heard footsteps approaching. "Charlotte," said a familiar voice. She turned and saw Anne, her old friend and one of the few people she trusted. Anne had worked at the company for years, and despite her discreet position as legal counsel, she had always stood by Charlotte, supporting her through difficult times. "And," Charlotte murmured, feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. "All of this, it feels so surreal." Anne nodded and stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on Charlotte's arm. "I know. And things might get even more complicated," Anne said, her tone indicating concern. Charlotte knew exactly what Anne meant. With her father's death, the reading of the will would reveal the true division of power and inheritance. Though she didn't expect much, part of Charlotte still hoped to be recognized, at least once, for her loyalty and work within the company. When the formalities were over and everyone returned to the Harrington mansion for the reading of the will, the air in the room felt heavy. The lawyers sat before the family, ready to open the documents that would seal the future of the company. Richard, as usual arrogant and confident, looked at Charlotte as though he had already claimed everything he desired. She felt a chill run down her spine. As much as she didn't want to admit it, this was a battle she wasn't prepared to fight. The lawyer began reading the will in a monotone voice, announcing the details of the distribution of assets. As expected, most of the inheritance was left to Richard, including the largest share of the company. Charlotte, however, received a small number of shares and a minor property on the outskirts of the city. Although the value wasn't insignificant, the message was clear: she was not seen as a worthy successor to the empire Samuel had built. Richard nodded slightly, satisfied with the outcome, but Charlotte remained silent, trying to process what had just happened. The injustice was palpable, and the resentment she had carried all her life only deepened. "This is ridiculous," Charlotte muttered to herself as she left the room. And followed her into the hallway. "You can't leave it like this, Charlotte," Anne said firmly but with compassion. "Your father may not have given you the recognition you deserved, but you still have a part of the company. And that may mean more than it seems." Charlotte stopped and looked at Anne, surprised. "What do you mean?" And glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "There's a lot more going on at Harrington Industries than you realize. I've seen some things that aren't exactly legal. And I think you should see them too." Charlotte frowned. "Illegal things? What are you talking about, Anne?" "Let's just say Richard has been engaging in some questionable practices to ensure the company's success. If you want to take action, this could be your chance to do something meaningful, not just for yourself, but to correct the course of Harrington Industries." Those words echoed in Charlotte's mind. Could it be possible that the empire her father had built was involved in something so corrupt? She never imagined Samuel would allow it, but Richard had always been too ambitious, willing to do anything to maintain power. Charlotte knew she was facing a difficult choice. Accept her fate and let Richard run the company alone, or investigate what was really happening and possibly risk everything to expose the truth. But deep down, Charlotte already knew what she had to do. The days following Samuel Harrington's funeral were bleak for Charlotte. The emptiness left by her father's death and the frustration with the reading of the will still weighed heavily on her. The coldness with which Richard had taken control of the company without considering her opinion or role in the family only fueled her desire to uncover more about the suspicions and had raised. Charlotte knew she couldn't confront Richard empty-handed. She needed evidence. After a long night of thinking about what Anne had told her, she decided to meet her friend at the company. She needed to know exactly what she was dealing with and how deeply her brother was involved in shady practices. The next day, Charlotte arrived early at the Harrington Industries building, a modern skyscraper that symbolized her family's power and success. As she entered the office, everything seemed to be running smoothly. Employees hurried through the glass corridors, and the sounds of conversations and typing filled the air. But there was something Charlotte hadn't noticed before, a discomfort, an almost veiled tension among the staff. She went up to Anne's floor and was greeted by her friend with a serious look. "Are you ready for this?" Anne asked in a low voice as Charlotte entered her office and closed the door. "More than ever," Charlotte replied, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. Anne pulled open a drawer from her desk and took out an envelope. Inside were a series of documents that looked like contracts and financial reports. "I managed to access some information from departments that work directly with Richard. There are transactions that simply don't make sense. Large sums of money being transferred to shell company accounts, contracts signed with partners without proper bidding, and bribes." Charlotte took the documents, feeling her pulse quicken. She flipped through the pages, noting Richard's signature on several suspicious contracts. "He's laundering money?" Charlotte asked, incredulous. "Laundering money and bribing authorities to secure favorable contracts," and said, taking a deep breath. "And this didn't start now. From what I've been able to find out, these practices have been going on for years, maybe even before your father's death." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. The company her father had built with such effort, the empire he had always presented as the pinnacle of honesty and hard work, was involved in a long-standing corruption scheme. And Richard was continuing this rotten legacy without any remorse. "I can't believe it," Charlotte murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she leafed through the documents. "How could this happen right under everyone's noses? And my father, did he know about it?" And hesitated before answering. "I can't say for sure. But the evidence points to your father at least knowing part of it. Samuel Harrington was a shrewd man, he knew how to keep up appearances. It's possible he started with small concessions to ensure the company's success, and over time, it grew into something much bigger. Richard just expanded the operations after taking on more responsibilities." Charlotte felt a mix of anger and disappointment. For so many years, she had lived in her father's shadow, believing in his integrity. And now, she discovered that the legacy he had left for Richard was tainted by crimes that could destroy everything. "What should I do?" Charlotte asked, her voice faltering for a moment. And moved closer, placing a hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "That's your decision. But you know you can't continue pretending this isn't happening. If these practices continue, the company will sink sooner or later. And you have a chance to stop it." Charlotte looked at the documents again. She knew the fight would be difficult, especially facing her brother. But at the same time, she felt she had a responsibility bigger than just preserving her own interests. It was about saving the company, restoring the family name, and, above all, maintaining her own integrity. "I'll do whatever it takes," Charlotte finally said, her voice growing in determination. And nodded, knowing this was just the beginning of a long and dangerous journey. "All right. We need to be careful. We can't act openly against Richard just yet. He has many allies within the company, and if he senses we're investigating, he could destroy any evidence. We'll gather more proof, and when we have enough, we'll take it to the board of directors." And paused. And if necessary, we'll take it to the authorities. Charlotte felt the weight of the situation grow, but she knew there was no turning back. She needed to discover how far Richard's crimes went and how she could expose everything without completely destroying the company. Leaving Anne's office, Charlotte felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. For the first time, she had a real chance to make a difference, to no longer be just the ignored daughter but someone who could change the course of something much bigger. However, as she walked through the glass corridors, watching the company's employees, she knew time was against her. Richard was dangerous, and if he suspected anything, he would do whatever it took to maintain control, at any cost. Charlotte needed to act quickly, but also cautiously. Her father's legacy was a shadow she could no longer ignore. Now, it was a race against time. In the days following the discovery of the documents, Charlotte's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts. She spent her days at the Harrington Industries office, trying to act normally, but inside, she was torn between two realities. On one hand, the cruel truth she had uncovered about the family business. On the other, the difficult decision of how to confront Richard without completely destroying the already strained relationship with her brother. She walked the halls of the company with a more critical eye. In every face, she saw the reflection of the trust the employees placed in the Harringtons. To them, the family was a pillar of success and security. No one knew about the schemes Richard was hiding, and that tormented her. Silence, however, no longer seemed like an option. That morning, Charlotte was in her office, the incriminating documents locked in a drawer. As she organized papers mindlessly, her thoughts wandered, trying to devise a plan to expose the truth in a way that would cause the least damage to the company and, at the same time, not allow Richard to go unpunished. It was then that Richard entered her office without knocking, as he always did. Her brother was an overpowering presence, and Charlotte felt the air grow heavier instantly. "Charlotte, we need to talk," he said bluntly, sitting in the chair across from her desk. Charlotte looked up, trying to hide her nervousness. "About what?" Richard gave her his typical superior look, a condescending smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. "About your involvement in the company. I know Dad left you with a small share of the stocks, but, honestly, I think it would be more practical if you sold your part to me." He leaned forward, as if offering something irresistible. "I'll pay you a fair price, above market value, and you'll be able to live your life in peace, without having to worry about the burden of managing such a large company." Richard's proposal caught Charlotte by surprise, but at the same time, it confirmed her suspicions. He wanted to get rid of her, remove her from any position of influence in the company so he could continue his illegal schemes without interference. But she wouldn't be manipulated so easily. "And why do you think I'd want to sell my shares?" Charlotte asked, keeping her voice as controlled as possible. Richard let out a short, disdainful laugh. "Charlotte, let's be honest. You've never been very involved with the family business. You've always preferred your travels, your side projects. You don't have the profile to manage Harrington Industries. I, on the other hand, have spent my entire life preparing for this. It makes sense that I should take over everything, while you," he paused, gesturing as if it were obvious. "Live your life without worries." Charlotte watched him for a moment, holding back the anger rising within her. How could he be so presumptuous? He thought he could simply buy her off, as if she had no value beyond the shares she owned. "Thank you for your offer, Richard, but I'm not interested in selling my shares," she replied firmly. Richard looked at her for a few seconds, the smile fading from his face. He stood up slowly, walking to the window of her office, where he stood with his back to her, looking out at the cityscape. "You're not interested," he repeated, as if pondering. "Funny, you've never seemed interested in the company before." He turned, now with a serious and threatening expression. "But if this is the path you want to take, know that I won't make it easy for you. Harrington Industries is my legacy, Charlotte. I won't let you or anyone else stand in my way." Charlotte felt the weight of those words. The brother she had known all her life, arrogant, self-centered, but always wrapped in a family facade, was revealing his true face. He saw no limits to maintaining control of the company, and now it was clear that she was a real threat to him. "Richard, I'm part of this family too. I have a right to be here and to help run the company. This isn't just about you." Charlotte stood from her chair, trying to contain the emotions boiling inside her. Richard looked at her coldly. "There's no place for you here, Charlotte. You've never fit in, and you know it." Those words were like a knife, cutting deep. Throughout her life, Charlotte had always fought to be seen, to be recognized as capable and valuable, both by her father and her brother. But there, at that moment, she realized she would never receive that acknowledgement from Richard. He would never see her as an equal. "That's not for you to decide," Charlotte said firmly, facing him head-on. "I'm not selling my shares, and I'm willing to fight for them." Richard stepped closer, his expression now hard and without compassion. "If that's your decision, then consider this a war, Charlotte. And I don't intend to lose." Without another word, he left her office, leaving a trail of tension in the air. Charlotte felt her heart racing and her body tense. She knew she had just declared a silent war against her brother, and he would stop at nothing to maintain control. But what he didn't know was that she had already uncovered what he was hiding. Sitting down again, Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to process everything that had just happened. It was a dangerous path, and Richard had just shown that he would have no qualms about taking down anyone who stood in his way. However, Charlotte was determined. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't let him destroy the company and what remained of her family's integrity. She called in and asked her friend to meet her that afternoon. She knew she would need loyal allies and a solid plan to expose Richard. As she waited, Charlotte looked out the window of her office, her mind still in turmoil. There was no turning back now. She would have to face not only the corrupt system Richard had established but also her own past and the wounds she carried from her family relationship. Time was running out, and Charlotte needed to act before it was too late. The next day brought a palpable tension in the air, as if something was about to explode. Charlotte knew that after the confrontation with Richard, he wouldn't sit idly by. The war had been officially declared, and the first battles had already begun, even if in silence. When she arrived at Harrington Industries that morning, she felt unease in the glances of the employees. At first, she thought it was just the pressure she had placed on herself. But as the day progressed, the whispers became more evident, and she began to realize that something was wrong. In the middle of the afternoon, Anne appeared in her office with a worried expression. "Charlotte, we have a problem," she said bluntly. Charlotte, who had been reviewing some reports, immediately stopped and looked at her friend. "What's going on?" And closed the door before approaching, lowering her voice. "Richard is moving faster than we expected. He's already started spreading rumors among the directors and staff about your emotional instability." Charlotte frowned, a feeling of disbelief welling up in her chest. "He's questioning my sanity." And nodded, her face showing the seriousness of the situation. "He's trying to paint you as someone emotionally unstable, incapable of making rational decisions for the company. He even brought up old episodes from the past, like when you decided to leave the country for a while after a fight with your father. He's insinuating that you have a history of erratic behavior." Charlotte felt a wave of anger rising within her. Richard was playing dirty, as always. He knew that if he could discredit her in the eyes of the board, no one would support her actions. "This is low," Charlotte muttered, feeling the weight of the false accusations. "And he's already influencing the directors," and continued, now more serious. "Several of them are starting to question your motivations, and there are rumors that Richard is preparing an extraordinary board meeting to discuss your removal from the board." Charlotte stood up, her body tense with the information. Richard was going further than she had imagined, and if he gained enough support, he could remove her from the company before she even had a chance to expose her findings. "We need to act fast," Charlotte said, determined. "We have to gather more evidence before Richard can take me down. If I can present the board with all the illegal practices he's maintaining within the company, they'll have no choice but to listen." And nodded, but the worry on her face didn't fade. "We need to be careful. Richard has many allies here, and some of them are directly involved in the fraud. They'll do everything they can to discredit you. Charlotte knew and was right. There was a network of corruption within Harrington Industries that she had only just begun to unravel. But what worried her most was the impact this would have on her reputation. She already knew she would never have Richard's respect, but now he was trying to destroy her credibility with everyone. However, there was no time to hesitate. "We have to continue the investigation," Charlotte said decisively. "We'll need something more concrete to present to the board." And agreed, but before they could discuss the next steps, a notification on Charlotte's phone caught her attention. It was a message from the board, calling for an extraordinary meeting in 2 days. "He's already called the meeting," Charlotte murmured, looking at Anne, and came closer to see the message and let out a deep sigh. "That doesn't give us much time." Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, trying to process the situation. Richard was speeding up his plans, and she knew he would be ready to use every dirty trick possible to remove her from the company. "We'll need a strong strategy," Anne said. "If you go into that meeting without something solid, Richard will crush you." Charlotte knew and was right. It wasn't enough to have documents and suspicions. She would need something incriminating, something that could tip the balance in her favor. "I'll investigate the financial movements from the last few months and cross-check them with the contracts we have," Anne said, mentally tracing the plan. "We need something that directly links him to the fraud. Maybe a money transfer, a fake contract, something that proves Richard's direct involvement." Charlotte sat down again, trying to remain calm. 2 days. That was all they had. 2 days to find something concrete that could save her position in the company and, more importantly, expose Richard. The next few days were a race against time. Charlotte and Anne spent hours reviewing documents, reports, emails, anything that could be used against Richard. More and more, Charlotte realized how deep the scheme went. Richard was involved in large-scale fraud and money laundering, but he had been meticulous. There were few direct clues, and finding undeniable proof was proving harder than they had imagined. On the eve of the meeting, Anne entered Charlotte's office with a worried expression. "We found something," she said, handing Charlotte a file. Charlotte opened the file, reading quickly. It was a fraudulent contract involving a shell company created by Richard, used to divert large sums of money from Harrington Industries. Richard's name was directly linked to the deal, and the fraud was clear. This could work," Charlotte said, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. "It could, but it won't be easy," Anne said. "Richard will fight tooth and nail to discredit anything we present. And we'll need more than just one contract. We need to build a solid narrative for the board, showing the entire scheme he's built." Charlotte knew time was running out, but now she had a real chance. It was risky, and Richard would certainly have a counterattack planned. But she couldn't let fear paralyze her. On the day of the meeting, Charlotte felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders like never before. The future of the company and, in a way, the future of her own life were at stake. As she prepared to face the board, she knew this battle would define the rest of her journey. If she lost, not only would she be removed from the company, but she would also leave Richard free to continue his corruption. When she entered the boardroom, all the directors' eyes were on her. Richard was already there, with his typical expression of confidence. He knew he had the upper hand, but Charlotte had something he didn't expect, a secret weapon that could bring him down. With the documents in hand and courage in her heart, Charlotte sat down, ready for the final confrontation. The Harrington Industries boardroom was filled with palpable tension. The fate of the company, and Charlotte's, would be decided in that very moment. She had spent the last few days meticulously preparing to present her evidence, knowing that this was her only chance to expose the truth. The nervousness was present, but there was an inner strength driving her. She was no longer willing to be silenced. Sitting at the board table, Charlotte waited for the right moment to speak. Richard, on the other hand, was relaxed, as if certain of his victory. He had already sown doubts about her emotional stability and was expecting to discredit her in front of the directors. But what he didn't know was that Charlotte had something more powerful than his rumors, indisputable proof. The board chairman, Jonathan Green, began the meeting with a somber formality. "We are here to discuss serious allegations," he said, his eyes shifting between Charlotte and Richard. "Mrs. Harrington has claimed that there are illicit practices within the company, involving Mr. Harrington. This is your opportunity to present these allegations." Charlotte stood up, her voice steady. "Thank you, Jonathan. What I bring today are not just allegations. I have documents that prove, beyond any doubt, that Richard is involved in fraud and money laundering within Harrington Industries." She handed the documents to Jonathan, and as he flipped through the pages, the silence in the room was deafening. Richard began to fidget in his chair, trying to maintain his composure, but his discomfort was obvious. "These contracts," Charlotte continued, "clearly show that Richard created shell companies to divert large sums of money from the company. The transfers were made to international accounts, without the board's knowledge. What's more, he involved other board members in these frauds, which only increases the gravity of the situation." Richard tried to interrupt her, but Jonathan silenced him with a stern gesture. "Let's hear what she has to say, Richard." Charlotte felt Jonathan's implicit support, which gave her the strength to continue. "These aren't just empty words, Jonathan. Here are the bank records that prove these transfers. Contracts signed directly by Richard, diverting funds that should have been used for the company's growth. He sacrificed Harrington Industries' integrity to increase his own profits. And it's not just an internal matter. Once this is revealed, it will bring legal and media consequences that could destroy the company's reputation if we don't act now." The directors were stunned. Many of them had trusted Richard for years, and now they were seeing the evidence of his betrayal before their eyes. Richard finally stood up, the calm expression he had maintained until now crumbling. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "These documents could have been forged. Charlotte has always been unstable. She just wants to destroy me because she didn't accept our father's will. She's willing to destroy the company out of personal revenge." Jonathan observed Richard for a long moment before turning his gaze back to the documents. "These papers are legitimate, Richard. I don't see how Charlotte could have forged so many financial records. And the most worrying thing is that you never mentioned any of these transfers to the board." The silence in the room grew heavier. Richard felt control slipping through his fingers. "Jonathan, Richard began, but his voice failed him. For the first time, he seemed truly lost. Jonathan stood, his expression serious. "Given the gravity of these allegations and the evidence presented, we will take immediate action. We will call for an external audit to investigate all of the company's transactions. And until that is completed, Richard, you are formally suspended from all of your duties within Harrington Industries." Richard remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, his confidence shattered. Charlotte knew that, from that moment on, there was no turning back. Richard's illegal actions were undeniable, and with his suspension, the truth would come to light. Jonathan turned to the other board members. "We will inform the press about this investigation and take measures to ensure that the impact on the company is minimized." He looked at Charlotte, his voice softer. "Charlotte, you've proven today that you're the only one capable of leading Harrington Industries at this moment. The responsibility is now in your hands." Charlotte nodded, feeling the magnitude of the task now resting on her shoulders. She had won the battle, but she knew the war was just beginning. Months had passed since the final confrontation in the boardroom. The fall of Richard Harrington, who once seemed untouchable, was swift and public. The evidence Charlotte had presented not only destroyed her brother's career but also triggered a large-scale criminal investigation. Richard and the others involved in the fraud were prosecuted and convicted. Images of his arrest splashed across business headlines, and Harrington Industries found itself at the center of a media storm. However, contrary to what many had predicted, the company did not completely collapse. Under Charlotte's new leadership, Harrington Industries underwent a profound transformation. She knew that regaining the trust of the market and investors wouldn't be easy, but with transparency and dedication, she slowly began rebuilding her family's empire. Charlotte was in her new office, now as CEO, gazing out at the panoramic view of the city. There was a quiet pride in what she had achieved, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The road to this point had been full of challenges, but she had restored the integrity her father had once lost sight of. Jonathan Green, who had become an important mentor throughout the process, entered the room with a satisfied expression. "The audit is complete, Charlotte," he said with a smile. "The fraud has been eliminated, and the board is impressed with the progress you've made. We're ready to hold the press conference and show the world that Harrington Industries is back, stronger and more honest than ever." Charlotte nodded, feeling a wave of relief at hearing those words. The worst was behind them, and now she could focus on making the company a place where ethics and transparency stood above any personal gain. "Thank you, Jonathan," she said, smiling, grateful for his guidance and support. "You did it, Charlotte. Against all odds, you saved what seemed impossible to save. Your father would be proud, maybe not of what he left behind, but of what you've done." She sighed at those words, reflecting on the memories of Samuel Harrington. For so long, she had fought for her father's approval, yearning to be acknowledged. Now, she realized she no longer needed that validation. What mattered was the path she chose to follow, her own values, and how she had shaped the company's future. "I don't know if my father would be proud of everything," Charlotte said, looking out at the cityscape. "But I've learned that I'm not here to repeat his mistakes. I'm here to do things differently, to do better." Jonathan smiled, understanding the meaning of her words. They had turned a page, and Charlotte was now in control of her family's legacy, transforming it into something she could be proud to leave to future generations. The financial impact of the crisis had been significant, and the company was still struggling to fully recover, but with firm and honest leadership, the future seemed promising. Harrington Industries, once fallen into the shadows of corruption, was now starting to be seen as an example of corporate rebirth. Charlotte looked at her reflection in the glass, and for the first time, she felt at peace. She was no longer the ignored daughter, the shadow of her brother. She had become the leader the company needed and, more importantly, the woman she had always wanted to be. As Jonathan left to prepare for the press conference, Charlotte picked up her phone and called in, her faithful friend and partner throughout the journey. "Anne, the work is just beginning. We're going to rebuild this company for good." On the other end of the line, and laughed. "I can't wait, Charlotte. I'm with you." With the call over, Charlotte took one last look at the city before preparing for the press conference. The future of Harrington Industries was in her hands, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Thus, the company rose from the ashes, not by the strength of a man or the inheritance of a name, but by the integrity of a woman who refused to let the past define her future. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.